Probably one good place to start is to think about the causal criteria that we have, and particularly to think about what does it mean when we have a longitudinal design, the temporal precedence being a part. Why is it important that we can be a little bit more confident, maybe not completely confident, but a little more confident if we have some longitudinal data? The second thing that we talk about is third variable explanations. So I told you, my little joke about the number of jackasses in a state is negatively correlated to the number of professors. There's some kind of universal constants there. Well, there's a third variable explanation there that more rural areas tend to have more farm animals and more urban areas tend to have more universities. So, the size of the community, the SES, the industry of the community is a third variable explanation for that association. When we think about causality, causality is really kind of a hard thing to think about because in language and in science, we have a lot of different ways of thinking about what we mean by the word cause. Does being dogmatic or wanting to have single right answers make you more authoritarian, make you more likely to support rulers who are not democratic? That's one way of thinking about causality. Then we also talk about causality in your human body. Is level of insulin related to diabetic shock? Is, as a matter of fact, in psychology, inducing an insulin shock was a therapeutic treatment for some mental diseases back in the day. Well, that kind of causality is instant. It's physiological. You're causing a certain level of a hormone to be present in the body. And, when we think about causality, well, yeah, that's a cause, kind of like the authoritarian causality example, but not really. And we also talk about cause that happens over time. One of the things that I have been involved in at Penn State was looking at where should government invest its money in education. And generally speaking, if you're going to spend federal dollars, you should spend them among young children. Pre-K, kindergarten, first, second grade is where you can intervene, promote literacy, promote reasoning, promote all of the good things that education has to offer. By the time you get to junior high and high school, it's hard to have an intervention that will provide as many benefits in terms of, will these people go into jobs? Will they have a job? Will they have a well-paying job? So, longitudinally, we talk about that kind of causality. If you invest early on, then later on, when they are adults and in the workforce, this is what we will have happen. The pattern that we're looking at here can be so to summarize, it can be longitudinal, it can be conceptual, as in the psychological example, it can be physiological and instantaneous, what David Hume would call efficient causality. Next, the word mediation. Is it the case that one variable affects another variable by means of a variable in the middle? And we'll have a little diagram to show you that. And to summarize, all of these things, the causal criteria we've had, why longitudinal data is good, what are third variables, when are we looking at causality and what do we mean by it, and mediation, are all related to multivariate designs. So remember, we had some criteria for causation. So these are necessary but not sufficient conditions for causality. The very first being some kind of a covariance. There's a scatter plot. There's a regression line. If you scatter plot the data and you see no relationship, gosh, it's hard to say that one causes another. In some situations, temporal precedence is a good thing to see, that investing in young children pays off later on. It's a little bit harder to make the case that it's only correlation if you have longitudinal data, because if you just have cross-sectional data, you can say, well, what were the third variable explanations for that kind of a scatter plot happening? But if you intervene, you do a study, and you give some people enhanced resources and not others, then you have a bit of a stronger case for causality. And finally, internal validity. So are these variables measuring what they actually purport to measure? And within the network of constructs that we have, are these constructs or our operational definitions actually making sense in terms of our general understanding of an area? Multivariate designs differ from what you've had so far in that we have more than two measured variables. Sometimes it's a longitudinal study, sometimes it's a multiple regression study. In multiple regression studies, we have one dependent variable, and in the case of, and maybe more than one predictor variable. So let's talk for just a little bit about longitudinal designs and why cross-sectional studies might not be the best thing. Getting older, I don't know if I've told you this story before, but you can imagine in your mind's eye that you're going to look at a scatter plot of people's typing speed and the number of errors they make. Well, if you think about that, it might be reasonable to think that that relationship is going to be negative, that those people who type faster are going to make fewer typing mistakes because they're better typists. And maybe the people who type slowly are going to be more prone to making errors. Well, can we infer causality from that? No. You wouldn't want to walk away from your study saying, hey, you want to make fewer mistakes typing? Speed it up. Only within a longitudinal study where we would take some people and tell them type faster, type slower, would you start to see that there is a relationship that even a good typist who types fast is going to make more mistakes than they do than when they type more slowly. And similarly, even a poor typist, when told to slow down even more, is probably going to be less likely to make mistakes. So longitudinal data gives us information that isn't possible from just cross-sectional work. And we'll have more to say about longitudinal studies and those three criteria that we talked about: covariance, temporal precedence, and validity. But, one of the things that people often say is, well, you're doing a longitudinal study, why not just do an experiment? Well, sometimes you can't, because what you're looking at is a longitudinal process. Developmental psychologists, for example, are really interested in how children grow and change over time. Well, you can't quite get at that cross-sectionally. Sometimes it would be unethical to submit people to the conditions that you're interested in looking at. So let's start off with a little bit of vocabulary. Cross-sectional correlations autocorrelations and cross-lag correlations. And the book talks about a study that has 4 occasions of measurement. And let's take a look at that. So what they did here was to look at a study of how much one overvalues themselves and how narcissistic the person is. And they conducted 4 times of measurement on that. Cross-sectional correlations are the correlations that exist between these variables at each measurement occasion. So one way you can think of a longitudinal study is it's a little bit like a replication study. You're just asking at each measurement occasion, is there an association? In this particular example, we see, at time 1, the correlation is pretty darn close to 0. And at time 2, well, it's a little bit better. And at time 3, we have a 0.14 correlation. Each of these can be thought of as an individual little scatter plot. And the reason that we call them cross-sectional correlations is they're correlations within each measurement occasion. Time 1's variable with time 1, time 2 with time 2, and so forth. And next, we have autocorrelations. Autocorrelations is the degree, can be thought of like a scatter plot between time 1 of a variable and a subsequent variable. So overvaluation time 1 to overvaluation time 2, that correlation, that standardized regression coefficient is 0.70. And similarly for 2 to 3 and 3 to 4. Now, if you want to be fancy here, that can also be called a lag effect. What are you doing? Sorry, forgive the parrot interruptions. And the same song's second verse also applies to narcissism, that, how stable is this over the course of time? It's possible to think about how many times of measurement are associated. So to expand just a little bit beyond the language that the book uses, these arrows that go from one measurement occasion to the next measurement occasion are called lag of length 1 variables. I could also draw an arrow from time 1 to time 3, and that would be called a lag of length 2 association. And sometimes these sleeper effects exist in the data. So this is one area where psychology borrows an awful lot from economics, because economists are really interested in time series data because they're interested in trying to predict the future of the economy. Sometimes those sleeper effects do exist. I know it's kind of a hackneyed thing, but it's kind of where I get my funding from, that if you're looking at freshman alcohol consumption, to some extent, freshman alcohol consumption also predicts alcohol consumption in juniors beyond sophomore. So there's something about that. Here comes somebody. Okay. This particular book does not talk about lag of length 2 or lag of length 3, but to me, this is just a little bit of vocabulary. Our third term is cross-lag panel correlations. Now, here is where the meat of looking at causal associations within a study that is longitudinal comes to the front. What we're doing here is we're looking at, is there a relationship between overvaluation time 1 and narcissism at time 2? Or is there more of a relationship between narcissism at time 1 and overvaluation at time 2? So we're looking at a time effect going on here. And these data tend to support the idea that overvaluation tends to make people more narcissistic than the reverse. Another little bit of language here. This cross-lag correlation effect has a special name. It's called Granger causality. And that's named after Professor Clive Granger. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics for this type of work. A little bit of a trivia thing, there is really no Nobel Prize in Economics. Actually, the Economics Award is funded by the Swedish banking industry. But you can Google Clive Granger's Nobel acceptance speech, and it's delightful because he's a very humble person. And he said, I really have no idea why you think that this idea is worthy of a Nobel Prize. And I know it's been used a lot. Sometimes it's been used a lot in some fairly nonsensical situations, though. And I thought, that's really sweet. I mean, here you get this lifetime award, and you spend some time not humble bragging, but saying, folks, there's some thinking that needs to go on here. So when you're talking about these models, it's not the case, and this is a point that this book does not really talk much about. It's not the case that we're just running these cross-leg models and these autoregressions and this cross-sectional ones. The model that we fit actually has all of these pieces all together in it. And if you happen to believe in cross-lag panel correlations, this 0.07 correlation that you're looking at here in 06 controls for an awful lot of other third variable associations. So let's just look at the green boxes and the red boxes. There's this association going on here, and that is after we have taken into account the fact that time one, narcissism and overvaluation are correlated, and you've also taken into account the fact that overvaluation at time one and time two are kind of stable things over the course of time. And actually, after we've controlled for these two variables, we're also adjusting for the fact that time two scores on overvaluation and narcissism are correlated. So that's one of the reasons why cross-lag panel associations are nice. Not only are they longitudinal, and the book spends a lot of time saying, oh, it's longitudinal, that's great. But the beauty of it is that it controls for all of these other reasons that overvaluation and narcissism might be related to each other over the course of time. So, the case is stronger for mom overvaluating the kid, contributing to the child's narcissism, than the reverse. How is that hitting you? I realize you haven't read the chapter, but this is me talking. But do you have questions about this part?
Could you scroll up back to the cross-sectional correlation slide?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So the way I think about it is, this is just kind of a replication over the course of time. Now, within the big picture, the way the figure makes it sounds like these are just correlation coefficients between these times. But when we actually have these data, this represents a correlation between overvaluation and narcissism after you've adjusted for what the time one scores were. Maybe a concrete way to think about this little arrow this little correlation here is if I did a regression and I predicted overvaluation time 2 from the time 1 variables, made the predicted scores, subtracted them from the actual observed scores, that would give me an error score. And did the same down here. This correlation here represents a correlation between errors of prediction. So it's a little bit different than the way the book talks about it, but the book is trying to convey it in kind of a simpler fashion. Put your critical thinking hats on. Just because I've drawn this picture, just because I've made these correlations for you, doesn't mean you should believe them for all of the reasons that we talked about that you should not believe a single variable regression equation. Are there influential observations? Don't know. Is the relationship between overvaluation time 1 and narcissism time 2 linear? Don't know. Same song, second verse for narcissism time 1 to overvaluation time 2. In other words, just because I show you this picture, don't accept it. But we're going to take as read that behind the scenes, if I were really analyzing these data, I would ask all of those critical questions. Cross-lag panel correlations get used a lot. In my work, I've published works on longitudinal studies of reasons for drinking. Why do you drink? Well, because it makes the party more fun. And we also have reasons not to drink. Regrettable sex being one of them. And God knows at Missouri, we have a lot of longitudinal data on did people drink? And we might be interested in the question, does having a reason for drinking, like because it makes the party more fun, cause you to drink more the next semester or not? Or is it the case that people experience alcohol and they go, oh, this made the party really good. And some of that alcohol consumption then gives them more reasons to drink. So that's kind of the ways that the cross-lag dissociation can go. Well, do you believe that? Well, the book would have you believe that. But we're among friends. So say this is the before times and you happen to be walking down, I don't know, down 9th Street, and it's Friday night, and you happen to see that someone has looked a little too deeply into their cups, and they're lying on the side of the sidewalk, and they're obviously inebriated. What do you think about that person? Do you think, oh my goodness, you poor thing, you must have experienced alcohol last week? Probably not. You probably think, oh look, a drunk. No, that's someone who has the trait of overconsuming alcohol. And in similar fashion, if we're looking at the example in the book, narcissism, personality researchers tend to think of narcissism as a trait, as a stable thing. And maybe each of these measurement occasions represents only an assessment of that general personality trait, that inter-individual difference. Well, now to be autobiographical, here is where I got my job at Missouri. that a lot of people, Ken Scher being one of them, had longitudinal data with semesters of assessment of Missouri students on a whole bunch of variables: alcohol consumption, marijuana consumption, personality, verbal ability, reasons for drinking, reasons not to drink, all kinds of, and psychopathologies like phobias and borderline personality disorder, all kinds of stuff. Well, what was going on when he was doing his studies, he said, you know what? If I look at the first semester people come here, there's a relationship with their second semester. And you know what? If I look at the first semester of your freshman time, that predicts the first semester of your second year in college, and it's negative. And, Ken is not one to rapidly rush to publication, but at that point he was saying, you know what, I think that means that if you're a freshman, you can experiment a bit, and this actually is a good thing for later on. And maybe my response was, maybe that's not really true. Maybe it's the case that some people who drink tend to drink again. Excuse me, you can leave the squirrels alone. Behave yourself. Nobody wants to hear you. So maybe these things are a trait. Well, let's take a look at what that looks like in terms of a picture. That overvaluation of your child might be a trait. Maybe some moms actually systematically overvalue their children, and they do that consistently across all times. And similarly, maybe narcissism of child is a trait. So these models, in terms of what happened with our studies of alcohol use, actually, these forward-pointing errors didn't really exist anymore in the data. It seems that if you're looking at how much do people drink while they're in college, it's an inter-individual difference. Some people drink a lot, God knows, and some people don't drink. And that's a stable thing. And it's not the case that there are these forward-pointing arrows at all in the data. And maybe there's just a general correlation between this trait and on the top and this trait on the bottom. Well, gee, when we fit those models and we use something called structural equation modeling, we found that those data fit really, really well. And if you fit the model this way, these cross-lagged associations no longer exist in the data. So we don't have causality because at the end of the day, we're stuck. We just have a correlation again up here between this trait and this trait. Now, in terms of statistical modeling, whenever I'm drawing a circle and pointing at these things, I'm doing something called factor analysis, called confirmatory factor analysis. And that's a little bit, more than regression and analysis of variance, so we won't get into it here, but, the words are kind of fun to use. And we are not promoting a new causal model. We're actually saying, you know what? There's a scatterplot at work here. Maybe your assumptions about causality are premature. So now to return back to the book, she does talk about longitudinal designs as fulfilling these criteria. Is there an association? Is there some temporal precedence in the cross-lagged? And is there internal validity? Is the association of these constructs making sense based on the theoretical network of what we know? The just as these are the criteria for causation, these are also the criteria for disproving causation. So in the case of a state trait model, the way that we knock down these cross-legged associations is by saying, well, actually, there's an association between two constructs. It's just kind of stable over the course of time. It's a trait. And similarly, if you're looking at internal validity, you can go back to the measures and you say, are these measures actually measuring what we think they are? One of the areas that, I'm very invested in is, especially if you're assessing verbal ability or reasoning ability in children, it's really important that you pay attention to the testing effects and the cultural situations that those children are in. A couple of things about that. When I was at the University of Iowa, for example, well, that's home to the Iowa Test of Educational Development, the American College Testing Program, Westinghouse, all of that. And as a result, they're interested in promoting testing and assessment. And the students would get packed up into a van and would be taken to given target schools for testing. Well, one of them was the reservation at Tama. And life being what it was on the reservation, they didn't want to do the math problems at their desks because their school classroom was not set up that way. It was set up with chairs, and then there were these blackboards all the way around. And they didn't want, the teacher also said, in our culture, we do not assess individual children. And that's another reason that we don't want to take these tests, because that would mean the individual children would be taking them. And William Kaufman, kind of a dried up, funny little professor, said, well, would it be okay to have them do them at the blackboard? Yes, that would be fine. So each of the students in our little group wrote a math problem on the board, and the children came forward to solve it. And what we noticed was all of the children would stand at the blackboard. They would look to the right and the left, and they would wait. And when the last student had done the exam, the question that was written there, then they would all turn around at once. In other words, it was really kind of a pretty thing. No one was coaching them. This was just what within that culture was acceptable. Maybe another example that would make you a little closer to your experiences would be early on in Iowa Test of Educational Development for kids. They'll ask questions about your home. They'll say things like, where do you cook most of your food? Well, in the kitchen. Yay, you get a point for that. You're talking about young kids. Well, and then where do you eat most of your meals? Well, the correct answer was in the dining room. And, I remember when I was a kid and we were taking those things. This is back in the old days when not only would you take the test, your teacher would then talk to the class about the items you missed. And she said, well, most of you got this wrong. Why? Well, nobody eats in the dining room. The dining room was this little place. Well, maybe you would eat in the dining room once or twice a year, like Thanksgiving or Christmas, but you didn't eat in the dining room. That was a place where you had fancy furniture and dishes to look at or something. It doesn't take into account the lived experience. Similarly, if you're talking about matters of race and ethnicity, Black children's scores are appreciably different if they're assessed by a person of the same race than if they're assessed by a white person. It speaks to the internal validity of your assessment. Let's revisit the issue of, let's just do an experiment. And sometimes you can't randomly assign people. One of the studies that we got to look at was a women's supplement, looking at reports of sexual abuse. Is that associated with, or sexual trauma, is that associated with alcohol consumption or other problem people might have in college? Well, you can't obviously assign people to an abuse category and not, but you can longitudinally look at the trajectory of those people. Especially if you're looking at things like parenting style and so forth, you can't really assign people to that as well. This is about where I thought we would be today, and I see we're about on time. The issue of going into third variable analysis is probably going to take me a little bit longer. Do you have any questions about this? We'll put a pin in it today.